Hi, thanks for stopping by again. I've got a story I would like to tell you today about my fourth great grandparents. And this is Austin Shepard Merrill and his wife, Laura Wilder Harris. And Grandma Harris, who actually became Grandma Merrill, went by the name of Lori. And so I'm just going to refer to Lori and Austin today as either Grandpa or Grandma Merrill. Okay. Now, Grandpa Merrill was born in 1802 in Connecticut, and Grandma Merrill was born in 1810 in Massachusetts. Okay. Now, at this time in history, and during this era, it was perfectly acceptable for girls at age of 14 to get married. Now, Grandma Merrill actually waited longer than that. She was 16 when she got married, and Grandpa Merrill was 24. And before she got married, though, Grandma Merrill, living in Connecticut, the area was well known for a lot of industry. And so there were excellent schools and a lot of theater and different things going on. So she had a very positive and a very enlightened upbringing. Okay. After their marriage, they were living in Massachusetts for a while, and is the case during that time, going on into the 1830s, a lot of people started moving out into the frontier. So they were headed out into New York, Ohio, and some of these places. And the Merrills did the same thing. And so they were living happily in a place called Erie, New York, and were doing quite well. Had a nice farm and a store, and were doing well until one day in 1838. There was a young man by the name of Lorenzo Snow who came through Erie, New York, and was teaching about a new church and about a restored gospel of Jesus Christ. And of course, he was a missionary. And based on Grandpa Merrill's Puritan upbringing, it said that he was probably very receptive to the Spirit and accepted the truth as the very quickly. And he became the very first Merrill to join the church. And I don't have the exact date of when Grandma Merrill was baptized, but the record indicates she was also baptized in 1838. Whether they were baptized together or separately, I don't know. And looking at the ordinances in Family Search, it looks like she was rebaptized much, much later after her death again. So I'm not quite sure of the original date on that. So anyway, they are now Mormons. And they had a desire, once they joined the church, to join the body of the saints and to head out to join the rest of the saints that at that time were out in the frontier, more or less. It said that they were quite wealthy, or I guess not wealthy is not the right word, but they were quite well off. They had a store. They owned a general store and had properties in Erie County, New York. And the records show that it took them about a year to dispose of all their property and their home and to make the move out to Nauvoo, Illinois. And they were in Nauvoo, Illinois for several years and were there actually when Joseph and Hiram Smith were both martyred. And at the time, it said that Grandpa Merrill owned quite a bit of property in both Jackson County, Missouri, and Nauvoo, Illinois. And being a very faithful person, he actually donated and gave to the church to sell a lot of land, and also donated funds so that the Nauvoo temple could be built. And he was very generous with the things he had to ensure that the Nauvoo temple was built. Both Grandpa and Grandpa Merrill had their endowments taken out in January of 1846. No sealings were done in the Nauvoo temple, and endowments were only done for a very short period of time, actually only 2 months. In December of 1845 and January of 1846 were the only time that endowments were done. And Grandpa and Grandpa Merrill were able to have their endowments done at that time. Jumping ahead just a little bit, it was actually 6 years later that Grandpa and Grandma Merrill were able to be sealed, actually in Brigham Young's office. It says on October 7th of 1852, they were sealed in Brigham Young's office, which is where the Lion House stands today. So kind of interesting. Things were done a little bit different back then. Let's go back now. We're in 1846. The family was living in Nauvoo. They left that fall and moved to a place that was known as Strington, Illinois, and they stayed there that winter and actually into the spring. It was in 1847 that basically the Saints were driven out of Nauvoo, and the Merrill family again were forced to leave all the comforts in their established home for the cause and search of religious freedom. They moved to Council Bluff, Iowa. They stayed the winter, and finally they joined up with the Y Company, called the Brigham Young Company, under the captainship of this group of saints that left under the direction of Elder Lorenzo Snow. And they arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in September of 1848. They had little time to dispose of their property as they were leaving Council Bluffs, Iowa. But they set out west. It says they had 2 very well-equipped wagons, which were loaded with seed, food, household necessities, and tools. Cows were driven by the side, and the cows were milked 3 times a day. Extra milk was put into a churn, and by the time the journey ended at the end of the day, it said fresh buttermilk and sweet butter were to be had for the evening meal or for cooking. They had a box of 12 chickens that were fastened to the side of the wagon box, and so a fresh supply of eggs were to be had every day. Each night when they camped, Grandma Merrill had the comfort of a feather bed, which she brought with, and a rocking chair, which she insisted would accompany her across the plains. So they started out on their journey, and the records indicate that when they reached the Salt Lake Valley, they had one wagon that was pulled by an ox and 1 cow. Most of the chickens had been killed for food, and the furniture and other items had been eliminated and put out or given to those in need, except for the feather bed, the rocking chair, and a churn. The feather bed and the rocking chair, Grandma Merrill would not part with. When they first arrived in the valley, they lived in a dugout that had formerly been a chicken coop. It said Grandpa Merrill and his boys scooped enough dirt out to make 1 room from the side of a mountain. And 9 days after their arrival into the Salt Lake Valley in 1848, Grandma Merrill gave birth to another son. And at that point, she was more than grateful to have that feather bed and that rocking chair with her. Said the first years in the valley were very trying. Grandpa Merrill was not without money, but money didn't do a lot of good if there wasn't any food to buy. The oxen that had helped bring them across the plains was killed for beef, and so their diet subsisted and was supplemented with wild onions, sago roots, and other roots that could be dug out of the ground. There was an immigrant company that were on their way to California, and Grandpa Merrill purchased a wagon from them that happened to have 15 bushels of corn with it, and the only problem was this corn was soaked with bacon grease and dirt. And so Grandmother Merrill took upon herself the task of washing that corn by hand and then thoroughly grinding it up in a large coffee mill that they had, and was able to make bread from it. If you remember the story of Johnson's army coming into the Salt Lake area in 1858, the saints were ordered to destroy their crops, fearing that the soldiers might come in and harvest them. Well, Grandpa Merrill didn't want to destroy his crops, and so even though it was very difficult and somewhat risky, he would actually make a trip back and forth as often as he could to take care of the crops that he had already gotten into the ground. And I'm sure it was a very harrowing experience for him to do that. But as a result of that, he was able to harvest 1,000 bushels of wheat that fall. This is in the fall of 1858. And it also says that during the Grasshopper War, and I think at least those of us that are Latter-day Saints know the story of the crickets and the grasshoppers. It says Grandpa Merrill was fortunate enough to have several hundred bushels of grain on hand. And when it became known that Grandpa Merrill had this grain, a group of men came in from Salt Lake City and offered to pay him $7 a bushel for that grain. And Grandpa Merrill is said to have replied, "Go purchase from men who have wheat to sell. I will not sell 1 bushel of wheat as long as my neighbors are in need." And that winter, he loaned out wheat to his neighbors and friends for a peck interest on a bushel, with the understanding that it would be returned as soon as they raised a crop of their own, whether that was 1, 2, or 3 years in the future. So if you got a bushel of wheat from Grandpa Merrill, you would pay him back the bushel plus a peck. Now, I didn't know what a peck was, so I looked it up. A peck is the equivalent to about a 2-gallon bucket, and 4 pecks make a bushel, if that helps anyway. Now that turned out to be a blessing, because later on the Smiths, or actually the Merrills move up to Smithfield, and he was able to have enough wheat on hand to help get the Smithfield settlement established. And again, the same thing happened. A group of men came up from Salt Lake and wanted to bargain for his wheat. He refused their offer, and that decision actually saved that community from starvation. And it says, the records note, that every bushel of wheat that Grandpa Merrill paid out and loaned out was returned with the peck for interest. So we mentioned in 1860, Grandpa and Grandma Merrill again got a call from Brigham Young and asked to go settle a new place up in Cache Valley, which became known as Smithfield. John G. Smith was actually called to be the first bishop in that area, and in his honor, Smithfield was named after Bishop Smith up in that part of the valley. They made a group that settled on what is known as Summit Creek and divided it up into lots. Of course, we know the story where Brigham Young encouraged them to build in a fort formation, and the Indians won't bother you if you do that. Well, I think several weeks ago I told you the story of Ira Merrill, who was my third great-grandfather. They went out to prepare a Bowery for a 24th of July party, and he was attacked and killed by Indians. And it was after this time that they decided they would follow the advice of Brigham Young and put themselves into a fort formation on that. Also interesting to note that before the first chapel was built in 1867, for almost 7 years, Grandpa Merrill's home was used to hold the Latter-day Saint meetings. That was the church house as well as his home for quite a while. And then after they built the church, Grandpa and Grandma Merrill's home was used as a school lunch center for another 4 or 5 years, where all the kids could come and have lunch there at their house. I did find one interesting story. It's about, I guess, one of my great aunts, one of the daughters of Austin Merrill. Her name was Sarah. Sarah was left at home one time to take care of the baby, and while she was home alone, she could see an Indian coming up towards the house, and she was very afraid. So she put the baby on the floor, and then took a big 5-gallon, what they call it, a 5-gallon kettle over the baby and put that on him. And then she ran to the fireplace and got in a coal shovel and put up a big shovel full of red hot coals waiting for that Indian to come. He ran to the door and found it was bolted. And he pushed and kicked, was trying to get in, couldn't get in through the door. So he went to a window and was trying to crawl in through the window when my great aunt Sarah took that shovel full of hot coals, threw him right in his face. And it said he gave a cry of fright and ran howling from their property. So that's pretty brave of a little girl. I don't know how old she was at the time, but quick thinking on her part. Now, back there in the 1860s, there were no shoemakers in Smithfield. And in preparing for the needs of a large family in pioneer country, Grandpa Merrill sent away for some equipment to make shoes. There was a company in Alden, New York, that would sell you all the supplies, and he became familiar with the art of shoemaking. There wasn't YouTube back in those days to watch a video, so I'm guessing he learned on his own. But he purchased several patterns of various sizes to meet the demands of his own children, as well as those in the local community, and he became the shoemaker. So at the close of harvest season each year, and after the hunting season was over, when the new hides were obtained and cured in Cache Valley, he would begin to make the rounds of shoemaking. I'm guessing he did this in the winter. Each home had prepared leather for him and had stored it away, waiting for an appointment with the shoemaker. Grandpa Merrill would go to a home by appointment, draw and make the shoes as needed, and he would sew and finish each pair. He supplied the entire family with shoes for 1 year before going on to his next appointment. In addition to shoes, he's also known to have made saddles, bridles, gloves, belts, and anything made out of leather that you needed. In return for his shoemaking, he was paid in what is known as the barter system. It says that often he would receive only enough flour to make 2 white biscuits for a day's work. That's not a lot. But it says that there is, in the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, apparently there is a display of one of the surviving pair of leather shoes that Grandpa Merrill made. I don't know if that's in Salt Lake or up in Logan or Cache Valley, but I thought that was interesting. Grandpa Merrill was also a successful farmer. He was also skilled in carpentry in addition to his shoemaking. And he did all these things so he could provide for a very large family. In those days, families worked together and helped neighbors in need. And Grandpa Merrill was known as a congenial, uncomplaining man. Now, it says that exposure to weather and irrigation water over the years, there were no rubber boots in those days, weakened his physical health until he finally developed bronchitis. And he died in 1874 at the age of 72 years old. By those who knew him, they said he was described as a genuine Christian in every element of what a true Christian means in deeds. He was mild-mannered, charitable, and congenial. Grandma Merrill was always a helpmate for her husband. It's said that she was very versatile. Her accomplishments were many. Therefore, anybody who needed assistance usually would seek her out for help. After the death of Grandpa Merrill, one of their sons moved in with Grandma Merrill to look after her in her old age. But even at that, when the son's wife died in 1881, Grandma Merrill then assumed the responsibility for helping raise the motherless children and to provide a home for his now widowed son, her widowed son. She died in 1833 and is buried alongside Grandpa Merrill in the Smithfield Cemetery plot. I guess there's a Merrill plot up there. So, just a short story about Grandpa and Grandpa Merrill. I think we can be proud of the fact that they sacrificed so much for the building of the Nauvoo Temple and were a help and a blessing to everybody who knew them. And that's a great legacy that I think we can be proud of. So thanks for stopping by. We'll see you next time, and take care.